A scary thought occurred to me not too long ago. What if global democracy collapsed just like communism did 30 years ago? For the longest time, I thought this was impossible. But not so long ago, people felt the same way about communism. At the end of World War II, many people started to think that communism was unstoppable. This video clip shows victory celebrations in the Soviet Union following the end of the war. They had good reason to celebrate. After losing tens of millions of their people in the conflict, they emerged with the United States as one of the two dominant superpowers. Part of that victory meant that the Soviet Union was now occupying much of Eastern and Central Europe. Inevitably, these occupied states would either be annexed in part or in whole to the Soviet Union, or they would become satellite states with their own communist regimes. At the same time communism was expanding in Eastern Europe, the Western European and Japanese empires were crumbling. Decolonization provided a further opportunity for communism to spread, so that between 1924 and 1980, communism had gone from just 2 countries to encompassing full 1/3 of humanity. Then, just 9 years later, without any warning, communism collapsed across the world. Here are people in Hungary saying they've had enough. Here are some others in Czechoslovakia saying the same thing. Suddenly, things we couldn't previously imagine were happening. The Berlin Wall fell with a sledgehammer instead of a nuclear warhead. What was even more amazing was that this was mostly peaceful. There were some exceptions, like in Romania, shown here, or in Yugoslavia and a handful of other places, but otherwise the transition was a far cry from the nuclear war everyone had been expecting. So, the last 100 years have seen so much change around the world. Why should we assume that democracies are immune? How well rooted is democracy really? Let's start with a definition of democracy. This is harder than you might think. Let's take the example of the United States. Many Americans living today might rightfully question whether we could call the United States of 200 years ago a true democracy. For example, there was slavery until a civil war and the 13th Amendment put an end to it in 1865. After many protests, women finally won the vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Native Americans were only made citizens in 1924 after the government recognized their military contributions during World War I. But even then, New Mexico and Arizona didn't allow them to vote until 1948. And it wasn't until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 that those rights were truly secured. Black Americans in the South were de facto stripped of political and civil rights until massive protests pressured the government to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Anti-war protests during the Vietnam War led to the passage of the 26th Amendment in 1971, when the U.S. government finally acknowledged that those subject to military conscription should have a voice in who runs their government. The vast majority of Americans would agree that prior to the expansion of civil rights in the 20th century, one could legitimately question whether the United States was a true democracy in the modern sense. But the truth is that expansion of democratic rights has been slow. The women you see in this picture are voting in local elections in a Swiss canton that didn't allow women to vote until 1990. In fact, it was pretty typical for older democracies to not extend voting rights to women until the 20th century. To keep things simple, and because I also believe that a little bit of democracy inevitably leads to more democracy, we are going to use a definition that was developed by the political scientists Bois, Miller, and Rosado of Princeton, the Australian National University, and the University of Notre Dame. To understand democracy in a historical context, they use a minimalist definition. There are just 2 conditions for them to consider a country democratic. 1, the majority of adult males can vote, and 2, executives and legislatures are elected in free and fair elections. It's not a perfect definition by a long shot, but it does make historical sense. Okay, so now we have a definition. How do we measure the strength of democratic culture? Bois and his colleagues methodically cataloged every year that any country in the world was democratic. I'm adding all of these years up to create a measure called democratic experience. I'm asserting that even if a coup or an invasion interrupted a country's democracy, the democratic experience had an impact on the local culture. For example, prior to the Nazi occupation of the 1930s, Czechoslovakia had a credible democracy. After brutal occupations by Nazi Germany and later the Soviet Union, the country restored its democracy with the Velvet Revolution of 1989. All right, we have a minimalist definition of democracy and a way to measure the strength of democratic culture. What does the world look like? Well, the world's oldest continuous as well as most experienced democracy is the United States of America at 200 plus years of minimal democracy. If we are looking at countries that have experienced more than 150 years of democracy, there are just 3 additions: Canada, Switzerland, and New Zealand. At 100 plus years, there's Australia, France, the UK, Iceland, Norway, Finland, and Greece. At 50 plus years, we see India, a cluster of countries in Latin America, and our first countries in East Asia, Japan and the Philippines. We also see the first country in Africa, Botswana. In Europe, we see the addition of more Southern European countries. At 25 plus years of democratic experience, we have most of Central and Eastern Europe, post-apartheid South Africa, and more countries in South Asia, as well as our first countries in Western Africa. Looking at countries with 1 plus years of democratic experience, we have almost the entire Western Hemisphere, more countries in Western, Central, and Southern Africa, as well as some countries in Southeast Asia. However, we also see a stubborn belt of despotism stretching from the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the Pacific coast of China. These great countries have never experienced any form of democratic government. But landmass doesn't equal people. So how can we gauge the strength of democratic culture in terms of human population? This time, starting with a number of people who have never experienced democracy in their countries, we have a little more than 2.5 billion people, or about a third of the human population. If we add to this people who live in countries that have experienced 1 to 25 years of democracy, we get to a little less than 4.5 billion people, or more than half the world's population, living in countries with less than 25 years of democratic experience. About 500 million live in countries that have experienced 25 to 50 years of democracy. Suddenly, we get a big jump in population in the 50 to 100 year range. Thank you, India. The 100 to 200 year range accounts mostly for people living in low population countries in Europe and Oceania, as well as Canada. Finally, we have the United States, with the world's strongest democratic tradition at 200 plus years. So, how well rooted is global democracy? Not so well rooted that we shouldn't worry about it. A third of humanity lives in countries that have never experienced it, and only a small percentage of the world's population live in countries that have even experienced a lifetime of democracy. What's worse, a number of countries that could once be considered free or partly free have become not free according to the NGO Freedom House. Those are the countries in red that you see on the map. The truth is that global democracy peaked at some point in the early 2010s. Since then, it has experienced a decline. Should we worry about the state of global democracy? Absolutely.